So we're interviewing my favorite economist, John Lott. He wrote one of my favorite books, which I, in no uncertain terms, would describe this book that he wrote as life-changing for me. It's called More Guns, Less Crime. Came out back in the late 90s. I think it came out in, I want to say it came out in 98. I read it a few years after. And I recommend everybody out there pick up that book. Truly, truly eye-opening. And the fact that John was an economist and came to this conclusion, more guns, less crime, through his training, with numbers and as an economist. He's now the president of the Crime Prevention Research Center, and you may have seen him on TV, radio, print. He's all over the place. It's very, very much my pleasure to interview you, John. How are you doing?
Doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Now, did you know that statistic that among economists, business and law professors, that you are the 15th most downloaded in the world?
Yeah, I guess I knew of that. So anyway,
that's awesome. I think it's what a testament to how innovative and important and interesting your work is, and congratulations for that.
Well, thanks. I appreciate you having me on.
For those that aren't familiar, can you you just give us some background? How did you get into the statistics that led to your work around firearms and Second Amendment issues?
Well, I mean, a lot of economists deal with crime. Economics has a couple basic points, but one of them is if something's more costly, people do less of it. If there's a greater return, people do more of it. And just like if the price of apples go up, people buy fewer apples. If it's riskier, if it's more difficult for criminals to go and commit crime, they do less crime. I mean, there's a lot of permutations on that, but that basic point, applies to lots of different areas in people's lives. And economists, that's one of the things we study. So, I was teaching. I've been involved in crime a lot. I've been chief economist for the U.S. Sentencing Commission, and I was teaching a class on crime at Wharton. I was at the Wharton Business School for 4 years, and I made the mistake of telling the students that we were ahead in the syllabus. And a couple of the students came up to me after class and asked me. They said, well, they knew it wasn't perfectly on point for the class, but given that we're ahead in the syllabus, would I mind giving a lecture on gun control? And I'd read some papers in the area that were really poorly done, but I assumed that there were other good papers there. But if I was going to speak on it, it kind of forced me to more systematically go through the literature. And when you're an academic, you do papers because you have a new idea or you think you can do a better job. In this case, I just thought I could do a better job, and one thing kind of led to another. And I decided to go and do some work in it, and I ended up getting attention, and it was hard to get away from it because I think I had been involved in a lot of academic debates, but never one where there was so much misinformation there. And I guess I just thought if I didn't stick around and do the discussion, nobody would.
What's an example of the misinformation? Like, what's just one example of something that people were misinformed about?
Oh, I mean, there's so many things there. One claim that I think is particularly pernicious is the claim that the United States is somehow unique in terms of mass public shootings. And yet what you find is that the United States actually has about 1% of the world's mass public shooters, even though we make up about 4.6% of the world population. So we're way, way, way below the average in terms of mass public shootings. So what happens is people also don't take into account how large of a country we have. We have over 330 million people. You look at countries in Europe, you have a number of countries that are like 5 million people or 10 million. Even the largest country in Europe, Germany, has 80 million people, so it's less than a quarter the size of ours. And you have to adjust for the fact that they just don't have that many people. Nobody would compare the total number of murders in Rhode Island with California or something like that. They'd put it in terms of per capita rates, because you have a lot more people there, you're going to have more murders. But yet they don't do that when it comes to things like mass public shootings. They don't do it when they talk about school shootings or other types of things. And when you do that, you realize that there are a number of countries in Europe that have higher per capita rates in terms of mass public shootings than we have here in the United States. It's just also that, and partly this is understandable, but attacks in the United States obviously get a lot more news coverage in our country than attacks in other countries do.
So,
but I mean, there's so many other things one could go into, just how people should behave when they're confronted by a criminal, and so on.
So if you're in a country where, well, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe this is a bad question. You tell me. You're really good at. I've asked you a lot of questions in the past. And you're always very good at correcting the quality of my questions, I guess, for lack of a better term. So maybe this is a bad question, but if you're in a country where guns are pretty much banned, and let's say it's a country that's, a tenth the size of the United States, so you would think that we would have at least 10 times as many, of these shootings, but they're a tenth the size, so, they have more. Maybe we only have 5 times as many when we should have 10 times, even though we have 10 times the population. I don't know what country I'm really talking about here, but where guns are banned, so people would assume, hey, we have more shootings in the United States than this other country, when in fact, no, per capita, they have, 15 or 20 times as many, even though they have a tenth of the population. Where are they getting these guns? Did you ever, if you're in a country where guns are pretty much banned and they don't have gun shops, where are the firearms coming from? Is that something that your research has ever uncovered?
Right. Well, I mean, one of the major sources of illegal drugs in other places in the world, including the United States, are drug gangs. It's not like a drug gang or a drug dealer can go to the police and say, this other gang stole our drugs, can you help us get them back? The different drug gangs there have to have their own little militaries in order to protect that extremely valuable property that they have. And we know how difficult it is to go and stop drug dealers from getting a hold of drugs. It's equally hard, it seems, to be able to stop them from getting a hold of the guns that they use to go and protect that extremely valuable property that they have. And, you look at a country like Mexico, for example. Mexico, since 1972, has had only one gun store in the country. It's run by the military. Guns are extremely expensive. You have to pay over a $2,000 fee just to apply to be able to be considered for a license to be able to go and have a permitted gun. And less than 1/10 of 1% of the adult population is legally licensed to own a gun in Mexico. The most powerful gun you can been able to buy since 1972 in Mexico is a 22 caliber short round bolt action rifle. Those aren't what are being used by drug gangs, and yet their murder rate has more than doubled since that restriction went into effect. And in many recent years, they've had a murder rate that's 6 times higher than the murder rate in the United States. And it's basically the drug cartels there bring in drugs from around the world, and they bring in the weapons from around the world that they use to protect that extremely valuable property that they have. But, it's if I could click my fingers tomorrow and cause all guns in the United States to disappear and all illegal drugs, how long do you think it would be before illegal drugs started coming back into the United States?
Yeah.
20 minutes if you live in El Paso?
Yeah.
And how long would it be before they would bring in the weapons to protect that valuable property? The same amount of time.
That's interesting. So, I mean, is it Is it reasonable? So, okay, so Mexico has, for all intents and purposes, almost no. It's really fairly impossible to own a firearm in Mexico, and it's definitely impossible
Legally.
Legally. For I guess what I'm saying is the average citizen in Mexico can't go purchase a center fire firearm with any kind of ease. I mean, it's almost non-existent that the average law-abiding citizen in Mexico has a firearm, but they still have extreme amounts of crime committed with a firearm, and that's coming from these drug cartels. But when you talk to people, especially gun control advocates, it's almost like that level of crime, those cartels, that crime with a firearm, it's like it doesn't count. Well, gee, that's not what we mean. We don't mean that kind of, quote unquote gun violence for whatever reason. I don't understand why they don't count that. But because it doesn't fit their agenda is probably the reason why they don't count that. But
they exclude countries that they say aren't developed countries usually. And even though Mexico is a developed country by the standard of the OECD, kind of the club of developed countries. But, that's usually, it's just how they define what countries to include. Because if you include all the countries that are classified as developed countries, what you find is that the countries with the highest gun ownership rate tend to have relatively low homicide rates and relatively low firearm homicide rates.
Tell you what, hey, John, this is Dave. We're going to take a quick break, pay a few bills. Can you hang with us?
Sure.
Great. All right, folks, this is Gun Owners Radio, FM 96.1, AM 1170.
The Answer.
All right, back to John Lott.
John, we were talking about Mexico and the difference between, what they count as crime and gun violence, and the difference between their gun ownership rates and crime rates, and the United States, their gun ownership rates and crime rates. Is it reasonable to say that the high percentage of gun ownership in the United States is one of the factors and one of the main reasons that we don't have enormous drug cartels that have basically taken over the country? John?
I'm not sure that that's it. I think there are a lot of things that determine how much corruption you have. I mean, I think one of the reasons why Mexico has the drug gang problem that they have is that they're next to the United States, and we have a big demand for illegal drugs. And so there are a lot of people there who make a big living going and supplying illegal drugs to the United States. They're a relatively poor country. They don't pay law enforcement as much as we pay our law enforcement and other similar issues. And so they have a lot more corruption there, and the drug gangs kind of fester there. I mean, we've had issues with prohibition in the United States. We had high murder rates there. We just put out a study a little while ago. 1% of the counties in the United States account for 42% of the murders.
Jeez.
The 5% worst counties account for 73% of the murders. By contrast, and even within those counties, murders are very heavily concentrated in tiny areas. In the worst 1%, most of those murders are in like 10 county blocks within those counties. And a lot of that is drug gang related. So we have one of the reasons why we have the murder rates that we do in the United States. Murder really isn't a national problem in the United States. It's very much a localized problem, but a lot of it has to do with drug gangs. So, I mean, we have our own problems with drug gangs here in the United States. It's not as much as it is in Mexico, but my own guess, just thinking off the top of my head, is that it probably has a lot more to do with the fact that Mexico has more corruption, in part because they don't pay their law enforcement and people in the legal system as much as we pay ours.
Well, is it reasonable through your research and just is it reasonable to say that, let's take Chicago, for example. Chicago is, huge crime. There's a lot of crime in Chicago, all kinds of different crime in Chicago. I would assume that is one of the areas in the top 1% that skews the numbers so much. I'd correct me if I'm wrong.
No, that's right.
Okay, so if Chicago, is it reasonable to say, or is it just not that simple? That, hey, Chicago, you can now own a firearm, you can now carry a firearm for self-defense. Is it reasonable to say that over time will have a positive impact on Chicago's crime rates?
Oh yeah, sure. But you were asking specifically about drug gang violence.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely, no, totally different question. Yeah, totally different question. But yeah.
If my research convinces me of anything, the people who benefit the most from having guns are the people who are most likely victims of violent crime. But, if you have more wealthy people living in the suburbs having permits, I mean, that's fine. But they're not the ones who are likely to be running into criminals. So you're not going to see the same reduction in violent crime as you would see if you make it so that the people who are likely to have crimes committed against them, like the ones you're talking about in Chicago, are the ones who are armed. It's one of the things with California and places like Illinois is how difficult and costly it is. They make it for law-abiding poor people, minorities who live in high-crime urban areas, to be able to go and have guns for protection. You just compare Illinois and Indiana, two neighboring states that are fairly similar in many different ways. In Indiana, over 22% of the adult population has a concealed carry permit. In Illinois, it's about 4%. Why the difference? Well, it's pretty easy to explain. In Illinois, it costs about $450 to go through the process to get a concealed carry permit. In Indiana, it costs $0 to go through the whole process to go and get it. And so what you see in Illinois is basically wealthy whites who live in the suburbs are the ones who go and get permits. I mean, $450 to go through the fee for the permit and going through the training costs. And in Indiana, you see a lot more people who live in poor, heavily minority zip codes. A few years ago, I was able to go and get the list of all the concealed carry permit holders in Los Angeles County. And, when you have the May issue type rules where you have to go and convince some local Democratic public official to let you have a permit. And what you find is that, one, there are very few permits. There were like 341 permits that were there out of an adult population of over 8 million people. But only 7% of permit holders were women. Only 5% were black. Only 6.5% were Hispanic. You compare that to the rest of the country where people don't have to provide a good reason. Women make up about 30% of permit holders in the rest of the country. Blacks make up about 12%, which is about their share of the black population.
Wow.
And Hispanics, even though Hispanics make up 54% of the population in Los Angeles County, they only make up about 6.5% of the permit holders there. And it's just, maybe women and blacks and Hispanics just don't have crimes committed against them in Los Angeles. I don't really think that's the case.
I don't think so either.
But apparently the powers that be that determine whether or not somebody has a good reason to be able to go and protect themselves, the powers that be just don't view them as having good reasons.
So have you reviewed SB2, the proposal that SB2 is here in California?
I don't have it memorized what the different numbers are. Is this the new one for concealed carry that they have there?
Exactly.
I know what's generally in it. I know California, Newsom wants to kind of go and follow what's happened in New York and New Jersey in terms of essentially banning people to be able to go and carry concealed handguns practically any place within the state.
He wants to basically make everything a sensitive area. If that passes, and let's say there's no injunction, if it passes and it goes into practice, for whatever length of time, like let's pretend that nobody sues, nobody gets an injunction, you know what I mean? It just passes, and everywhere, for all intents and purposes, most places outside of your home are sensitive. What do you think that will do to California? How will that affect California?
Well, you have very few people that have permits to begin with in California,
That's
and
true.
so it's not going to have a huge impact there in terms of changing things. I mean, it will prevent you from getting the benefits. So, like as of February a year ago, in Los Angeles County, there was like one permit holder for every 5,600 adults in the county. In San Mateo County, where they had another mass public shooting, there was one permit holder for every 24,000 adults in the county. Mass public shooters in California really haven't had much to worry about in terms of running into somebody who's going to be able to go and stop them. I think that's one of the reasons why you've had so many mass public shootings in California.
Which in the press conference, John, that's the press conference was the governor and the attorney general and a state senator, and it was kind of the premise. It was like, hey, we have all these mass shootings, therefore we're going to pass SB2, which will limit where people can carry, and which is the exact opposite of what they should be doing. And a reporter even kind of brought it up. They said, well, what kind of problems have you had with CCW holders? And of course, the governor just got mad, basically. Did no answer. He got mad and said, this is the kind of pushback that stops success or whatever. Meanwhile, it was a very reasonable question by an unbiased reporter. I thought it was absolutely ridiculous. He was unable to answer it.
Well, I mean, they've had the same questions and the same reactions from politicians in New York. Kathy Hochul was asked when she was pushing for creating all these gun-free zones in New York. She was asked the same question and was also unable to answer it. And the reason why they can't answer it is because permit holders are incredibly law-abiding. And, what you find is that permit holders are convicted of firearms-related violations at 1/12 the rate that police are convicted of firearms-related violations.
I knew it was less. I didn't know it was 1/12. That is extremely significant.
Right. Well, I mean, those are the types of reports that we put out at our website at crimeresearch.org. But and officers are rarely convicted themselves of firearms-related violations at about 1/20th the rate of the general population. And so, it's.
John, do you have one more segment in you? Can we hold you for one more segment? I just have a couple more questions, if you have time.
Sure, happy to do it.
Awesome. Thank you, John.
All right, hey, we're going to take a quick break. This is Gun Owners Radio, FM 96.1, AM 1170.
The Answer. So we're talking to John Lott. Extremely interesting gun statistics and some of the conclusions that have come from your research. And I want to take a step back. And one of the things that is really impressive to me is we talked a little bit about how you got into this and how it got started. But you're not the NRA. You're not funded by the NRA. You didn't come about this. I guess what I'm saying is you weren't involved in Second Amendment activism, and if memory serves, you weren't like a big gun owner prior to this. You truly went into the research, did good science, and came to conclusions, without having preconceived notions. Is all that fair to say?
Right. I never owned a gun. Nobody in my family had owned a gun. I didn't grow up with anybody in my household or family owning a gun. So, yeah, no, I hadn't been involved with it. I probably would have been classified as being somewhat in the middle of the debate. I'm sure I was affected as much as others by, the violence that you see in the news coverage there. Now I kind of realize how biased the media coverage was, but I wouldn't have known that at the time.
Now, one of the things that I remember that I was really impressed with was some of the terminology that led to some of the misinformation. And I recall, if you don't mind talking about, there was a myth that you're more likely if you're killed by someone with a gun, then you were in a relationship with them or something along those lines. And when you dug into that, you found out that it had to do with the way the FBI defined a relationship. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
Well, I don't know. There are a number of points that might be related to what you're talking about. I mean, look, one of the things people hear is that over half murders in the United States involve acquaintance murders. And when people hear that, they're thinking about people who are somehow emotionally, attached to other people. And that's simply wrong. The vast majority of acquaintance murders involve rival gang members. I mean, it's very common for the members of one gang to know who the members of another gang are. But acquaintance murders are much broader than most people might think. So, for example, if a robber goes up to the side of a taxi cab and robs and kills the taxi cab driver, that's classified as a stranger murder. But if the robber is in the back of the cab and is getting a ride from the cab driver there and robs him and kills him at that point, that's classified as an acquaintance murder because of the perceived financial relationship that existed between the robber and the taxi cab driver. So,
and that's that's the point right there, John, because it's so misleading. It's frankly dishonest of the other side. They make it sound as if there are millions of cases of people who are dating or married, and they kill each other with a gun, and that's somehow a likely scenario. When the reality is, it's not like that at all.
Look, I mean, there are tons of misinformation that's out there, and it's, the news media has a big impact on people's perceptions. Entertainment television does. A couple of years ago, we went through all the TV cop shows on ABC, CBS, NBC, and Fox. About 85% of the guns that were fired by criminals in their TV cop shows were machine guns. If you look since the 1930s, there's been one murder in the United States involving a machine gun. So you could watch one episode of Magnum PI or something, and you think that, more people are killed in Hawaii on any given day with machine guns than in the entire United States since the 1930s. It's not surprising that so many people are in favor of gun control. When you constantly hear about bad things that happen in the news with guns and virtually never hear about the benefits, it's not surprising that people think that if you just get rid of guns, the situation will be better. So year before last, we went through and did an extensive deep dive on media coverage on defensive gun uses. You look at the top 5 newspapers in the United States, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, the New York Times, the LA Times, the Washington Post. Between those 5 papers that year, they had a total of 10 defensive gun use stories. And the ones that they did have usually had something go wrong. The wrong person was shot, or the gun was taken away, or they got in the way of the police. Something went wrong. By contrast, they had 1,700 plus news stories about people being killed or wounded in crimes with guns. They had over 2,700 news stories of crimes being committed with guns. So, and even if you add in MSNBC and CNN, you get zero defensive gun uses being reported over the year there. So somebody could think they're very well read. They keep up with the news all the time. And they would think, look, there's like no benefit from having a gun, lots of crime. So why not just get rid of guns there? We went through, if you look at all the news stories and all the sources, you'll find about 2,000 defensive gun uses on guns. But just give you an idea of how the media misses this. Most of the news stories on defensive gun uses involve instances where the attacker was killed. 42% of them involve instances where the attacker was wounded. Only 4% involve instances where a simple brandishing of a gun stopped the attack.
Yeah.
Now, if I'm editor of a news bureau and I have two stories that come across my desk, one case, there's a dead body on the ground. In another case, let's say a woman's brandished a gun, the would-be attackers run away, no shots are fired, no dead body on the ground. You're not even sure what crime would have been committed. I think anybody would pick the first news story over the second one in order to run. But it has an impact. Just because something is newsworthy, if it bleeds, it leads type of thing, doesn't mean that it reflects reality very well, because in reality, about 95% of defensive gun uses involve instances of simple brandishing of a gun. But you would never know that.
Can you talk? We just have like four minutes here. Can you talk about the misleading, the way they talk about mass shootings and what they qualify? When most people think of a mass shooting, they think of some deranged person who goes into a school or a theater and just random havoc. But that's not. That's a small percentage of what is counted as a mass shooting. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Right. So the way the FBI defines active shooting cases are attacks that occur in public. They're not part of some other type of crime like a robbery or a gang fighting over drug turf. And they include anything from one person being targeted and missed all the way up to a mass public shooting. And the reason that they have the definition that they do is to try to get at the types of cases you're talking about, where somebody goes into a place, a school or a mall or a movie theater, and the whole point of the attack is simply to go and kill other people. So over the 8 years from 2014 to 2021, the FBI claims that there's 252 of those cases. Now you'll hear that there's one mass shooting a day in the United States, and that data comes from some place called the Gun Violence Archive, and they define it as 3 or more people wounded. Usually mass public shootings are 4 or more people killed. That's kind of the traditional FBI definition of it. But the other thing is the vast majority of their cases, about 87% or so of the cases from the Gun Violence Archives, are drug gang fights over drug turf. And look, I think people being killed in either way is important.
Tragic. Sure, yeah.
But what they do is people will go and mention some of the high-profile mass public shootings, and then go and mention that there's one of these occurring a day, and they make
2 minutes
think that there's one of those types of attacks occurring a day, and that's simply not the case. These are overwhelmingly drug gangs fighting against each other, and most of the rest are just robberies or other things that have happened. So the causes and solutions to stopping drug gangs fighting against each other over drug turf are very, very different.
Exactly.
And and there's a reason why the media doesn't cover those very much compared to these other mass public shootings. And yet, Biden or this Gun Violence Archive, which, by the way, the Gun Violence Archive was caught recently lobbying the Centers for Disease Control to remove information on defensive gun uses from their website, complaining about, just to give you an idea where the group is coming from, they were complaining that was making it hard by having numbers on the number of defensive gun uses was making it harder for them to go and push for gun control.
To lobby, of course. John, where do people find more about your work and maybe support what you're doing? How do we find you?
At our website at crimeresearch.org, crimeresearch.org.
All right, man. Hey, appreciate it. Great show. Folks, we're going to take a quick break. This is Gun Owners Radio, FM 96.1, AM 1170.
The Answer.